Disclaimer. The following is a fan-made production. Lorekeeper Studios does not claim to own any of the characters, locations, or scenarios found within the Hyrule Warriors game or the Legend of Zelda series. All such rights are reserved by their respective owners. This production is made out of a love for the stories that have already been told, and we encourage you to support the original products. Thank you, and enjoy the show.
The Angel of Destiny, Episode 1, Psychostorm. Chapter 1, Far From Home. The following account is as it appears within the Journal of Tycalra. This account was written 6 months after the disappearance.
I was never really one to believe much in fate. In my experience, any event that occurs in this world can be traced back to the choices of someone. Even if it's something that is completely out of anyone's control, it's still up to each individual person to decide whether or not they're affected by it. Or at least, that's what I believed. Even now, I think I'd still stand by that philosophy, but considering the way my life has gone recently, I'm not sure how much I can pin on the choices other people make. I'm writing this for me. I think that this is the best way for me to figure out what's been happening to me lately and what I need to do about it. So, I'll start from the beginning and describe in as much detail as I possibly can the events that have occurred over the last 6 months of my life. Before any of this ever happened, I was a mostly normal kid. I went to a normal high school, hung out with normal people, and did normal things. Although I always knew I was different from everyone else. I knew I didn't belong. I just wasn't sure how different I really was. At the time, the only thing that was noticeably different about me was my severely antisocial nature. I wasn't into most of the things that quote-unquote normal people liked. I didn't do sports, I didn't listen to a lot of pop music, and I didn't really like socializing. Instead, I was a storyteller. If it had a story to be told, I was into it, be it movies, books, video games. I loved learning about other worlds and seeing how people reacted to completely insane situations. I was perfectly content with my life, but it did often keep me from making a lot of friends, and in the eyes of anyone, except for a relatively small group of people, I was a nobody. I kept to myself, did my schoolwork, and generally just avoided angering the people who might possibly want to hurt me. Writing this journal, I realize how funny it is that someone can go from being a complete loser to the most popular kid in the school in just a few months. But I guess that's life. One minute it's just you versus the world, and the next you're being asked to lead an army of men who are all at least twice your age. To say that I wanted to get dragged into a war would be so far from the truth. I would say they were on opposite ends of the world. I wasn't a fighter, nor was I interested in the military at all. But for some reason, after everything that's happened, I can't imagine my life going any other way. There was nothing I could have done to prepare for the events of the last few months. The day that I got dragged into the war started off like any other, and despite being so long ago, I can remember everything about that day with surprisingly vivid detail. I guess that's one of the perks of a photographic memory. Like any other day, I woke up early that morning, donned my glasses and my favorite green hoodie, and trudged off to school. Throughout the day, there was nothing out of the ordinary. I went to all my classes like normal, and everything was exactly how it should have been. Even in the natural world, there wasn't any indication that anything was different about that day. The sky was bright and clear, the plant life was natural. If there were any signs of something being amiss, they weren't apparent to the normal human eye. I remember the bell had just rung, and I was on my way to the buses when the bright, cheery sky suddenly became dark. Looking around, I also noticed a faded purple tint in what little light there was left. I turned back to the school courtyard and noticed many of my fellow students pointing up towards the sky. Upon following their direction, I saw a small, glowing orb floating high above the center of the courtyard. The sphere was surrounded by a vortex of dark clouds, almost as if it were a hurricane. But there was no wind or rain. It was actually quite peaceful. I wasn't certain, but it seemed that this orb was the source of the mysterious purple light. Looking closely at it, I thought I had seen something like it somewhere before, but no matter how hard I thought about it, I couldn't quite place it. Hesitantly, I and many other students began approaching the orb in the sky in order to get a better look at it. As I slowly stepped closer and closer, a feeling of dread began to form in my chest, and it only got stronger with every step. It seemed that all the other students had noticed the orb by this point, and I could hear each individual discussing their various theories as to what the orb was. Many suggested that it was a secret government project that was being tested. Others offered the ideas of aliens, and some still suggested more obscure ideas that I do not feel the need to mention. I stopped a distance away from the orb, squinting and trying my hardest to identify what it was I was seeing. I was certain now that I had seen it somewhere before, but I couldn't come up with anything. The whole courtyard quickly became filled with the chatter of people trying to identify the object. Students, teachers, and staff members all stood together discussing the strange new object that had appeared within the sky. As we stood there, I, along with several other people, noticed that the light was getting brighter, almost as if it were charging energy for something. Suddenly, an enormous pillar of light shot down to the earth from the orb, striking the center of the school courtyard. Once it touched ground, the pillar began to generate a large ring of energy that quickly started to spread out from its origin. As the ring passed over the terrain, it caused it to disappear, replacing it with a barren, rocky ground. Even the people that were standing there when the light passed over them seemed to completely disappear from existence. My fellow students and I immediately panicked and started running in the opposite direction, but it didn't take long to realize that the ring was expanding far faster than any of us could run. I turned back periodically to see just how much time I had left before the light would catch up to me. Once, while doing this, I tripped on the curb, causing me to fall to the ground. With lost hope, I shut my eyes as tight as I could, not wanting to witness my last moments on Earth. I laid on the ground helplessly, awaiting my inevitable demise. But the moment I expected the light to pass over me, I instead felt a strange sensation, almost as if there was a strong gust of wind. As soon as that feeling was gone, I felt something I wasn't expecting. I felt rain. I opened my eyes, only to realize that not only was I still alive, but that I hadn't left my place on the road. I stood up and looked around, trying to figure out exactly what had happened. If we hadn't gone anywhere, then why did it appear as if everything beyond the ring of light had disappeared? All of my fellow students seemed to be just as confused as I was, everyone checking to make sure that they weren't dead. Despite seemingly making it through the situation alive, I still had a strange sense that something wasn't right. I decided to investigate further and see if I couldn't figure anything out on my own. I knew that I recognized the orb in the sky from somewhere, and I was certain that remembering what it was would help me figure out what had happened. So, hoping to find something that might help me remember, and in turn figure out where we were, I ventured outward toward the edge of the ring that I had seen before. I darted through the now drenched courtyard that had been bright and sunny just moments before. The rain seemed to fall harder and harder with every step as I rushed toward the outer reaches of the school, dodging teachers and staff who had now started gathering up students in the center of the courtyard. They worried me a little bit at first, but I quickly realized that through the chaos of the recent events, they were having a hard time getting anyone to stay calm, and they weren't really able to pay attention to someone like me. Much to my surprise, it wasn't long before I caught up to the ring that had previously been moving twice, if not 3 times as fast as me. Shortly outside the school bounds, it had completely stopped moving, and I was able to clearly see the separation between the landscape I was all too used to seeing and the rocky terrain I had previously observed. Standing right next to it, I was able to get a much better look at the ring itself. It had a beautiful and intricate pattern, as various glowing lines weaved in and out of each other. While I stood there, the same feeling of familiarity that had haunted me since the light had appeared in the sky returned, and I thought as hard as I could, trying to figure out what it was that I was forgetting. but all I ended up finding was how to get a headache. Realizing that I was getting nowhere trying to remember something about it, I decided to experiment and try to learn something about it instead. With nothing to gain by simply staring at it, I hesitantly stepped over the ring from the world I had known to this new and foreign land. The moment I placed my foot onto the dusty terrain, the ground under my feet cracked, and I felt as though an intense weight had fallen upon me, dragging me harder toward the ground. The sudden increase in gravity caught me off guard, causing me to stagger and fall to the ground, further increasing the size of a small crater I had made. I sat on the ground for a moment, trying to make sense of the sudden shift I had felt, wondering to myself why on earth such a difference would occur. But while I sat there, an unfamiliar voice called out from behind the rocks in the distance.
Ah! General Tycalra!
I jumped at the call of this strange and unexpected voice. Turning my head toward the sound, I noticed a large group of men turning a corner around the large boulders in the distance. They were all dressed in heavy metal armor, making them look like medieval knights. They all carried large swords and shields, and the vast majority of them wore helmets that blocked their faces. As I observed the unexpectedly large group of men, one of them approached me. The man was far taller than many of the others, and his armor was of a much finer quality, being glazed with a fine gold trim and possessing intricate patterns along every piece of the set. He was clearly the leader of the group.
It is a pleasure to finally meet you, General.
I gave the man a confused look, and he even looked behind me in a really cliché way to make sure that he wasn't addressing someone else. Not seeing anyone else he could be talking to, I returned my gaze to the man. I tried to stand up in order to address him more properly, but I found the sudden shift in gravity too difficult to overcome at the moment's notice. Falling back to the ground, I decided to just talk to him from my current position. I'm sorry, but who are you talking to? Not seeming to notice my struggle to stand up, the man cocked his head, as if he were the one who didn't know what was going on.
Are you not the one who calls himself Tycalra?
Yes? I hesitated. It was true that I sometimes assumed the title Tycalra when I was in situations where I felt my real name wouldn't be appropriate. However, hardly anyone actually knew me by that name. I really only used it in online settings, and those people never saw my face. There was no possible way this man could recognize me as Tycalra. How did you know that name?
How do I know that name? How do I know that name?
Yes, that is what I asked. How do you know that name? It's mostly secret. No one who knows that name knows my face. The man burst out in a frantic laughter. His booming voice had clearly attracted the attention of my fellow students back at the courtyard. I turned back only to see that a large crowd had gathered at the edge of the ring, with a handful of the students snickering and pointing in my direction. Feelings of humiliation rushed through my mind as the man seemed to mock me. I opened my mouth to ask him to be quiet, but he spoke first.
Oh, sir. The legend said you would have quite the sense of humor, but I never expected anything like this. Everyone knows the legends of Tycalra, the angel who soars across the universe protecting the weak and helping those in need. You truly are exactly as the legends say you are.
And what exactly do these legends say?
What is there to say? You match them exactly. Your confident and demanding demeanor, your incredible humor, dare I say more? Even your clothes match the description of your previous ventures into this land.
Wiping tears of laughter from his eyes, the man looked up and down my figure as if to examine my full appearance.
Although, I don't seem to remember anything about glasses. You told the princess that you only wore glasses on your first trip to...
He didn't even finish his statement before his expression changed from joy to horror. He quickly dropped down to one knee in a respectful bow, I jumped slightly. I wasn't expecting such a sudden gesture, especially following the spectacle that had preceded it.
Oh my, I'm so sorry, young man. I didn't realize this was your first visit to Hyrule. If I had known, I wouldn't have mistakenly mocked you so openly. I hope you will accept the apology of this foolish captain.
I was unsure as to how to respond to him. I had just met this man, and in the span of a few minutes he had gone through at least 3 different mood shifts. Not to mention he had completely humiliated me in front of hundreds of my peers. And a part of myself told me not to forgive him for it. But my good side got the better of me in the end. I will accept your apology, if you will explain to me where we are, who you are, and who you think I am. The man stood up and nodded his head, and even extended his hand, offering to help me stand up as well.
Of course, sir. You may call me Captain Bargain, and welcome to Hyrule.
Chapter 2. The Battle of Youth. The following is a continuation of the account residing in Tycalra's journal.
I couldn't tell if the captain was being serious or not. Hyrule? That can't be right. Hyrule is a fictional world from a video game series.
Unfortunately, I do not possess the information that would be able to explain this to you. That information is reserved for the royal family, so Princess Zelda could. Once we finish our work here and the point is secure, then we will be sure to take you to her.
I looked around, wondering what he meant by securing this point. There were no visible threats, at least that I could see, and up to this point nothing particularly dangerous had happened. Almost as if reading my thoughts, Captain Bargain began to address my confusion.
You're lucky we got here when we did. We received word that Sia's armies were approaching this point. We immediately rushed here as fast as we could.
It was at this particular moment that I made a horrible realization. We hadn't just been pulled into a fictional world by some magic beam of light. We had been pulled right into the middle of a war. I was talking directly to the Hylian army, and they were supposedly going to protect us from a threat that we had no way of even comprehending. I realize now that I probably should have made this connection sooner, but I think the reason I did it had something to do with the fact that the presence of a large group of medieval soldiers was being superseded by a ton of other issues. I turned back to look at my fellow students, only to notice a handful of them having already come to the same horrific conclusion. None of us had signed up for anything like this. We were entirely unprepared and untrained to deal with anything of this magnitude. I turned back to Captain Bargain and noticed a lesser soldier speaking to him. The soldier spoke softly, so I was unable to make out what it was he said, but I could tell by the captain's expression that it wasn't good. Captain Bargain turned back to face me, his grim expression unchanging.
Sir, I understand that you are still very confused and that you likely have never done anything like this before. But I just received word that Sia's army is extremely close to this location and we need to take action immediately. Hylian law dictates that you are to be appointed general upon your arrival in our country, so I would like to ask you to lead the army.
I was speechless. I had no combat training, no experience in fighting, or even leading for that matter. And yet, they were asking me to lead an entire army into battle? In the end, I'm not entirely sure what convinced me to agree. Perhaps it was the desperate tone of the captain, perhaps it was the desire to protect my friends who stood behind me, or perhaps it was just the sheer curiosity of the moment. Whatever the reason, I nodded my head in agreement. The captain also nodded, this time in respectful confirmation, before calling to the lesser soldiers.
Would one of you mind offering your weapon in order to arm our new general?
With his call came a host of blades raised in the air. As far as I could tell, they were all the same, likely manufactured in the same place. The captain gestured to one of the men who had raised his sword, who promptly approached, bowed, and raised his blade to offer it to me. Graciously, I accepted the gift, taking it from him and slinging the sheath over my shoulder. With a single, fluid gesture, I drew the sword, holding it out in front of me. Despite its large and cumbersome appearance, the blade seemed surprisingly light, and I was easily able to swing it around as well as smoothly slide it back into its sheath.
What are your orders, sir?
I thought for a moment, trying my hardest to come up with a decent strategy. I had no real idea as to what I was doing. I had never come up with a legitimate battle strategy, and considering how many lives were at stake, this proved to be much more of a challenge than I would have thought. With a variety of ideas cycling through my head, I decided on a plan that I felt would result in the fewest casualties for both my fellow students and my newly acquired army. I returned back over the ring in order to announce my plan to the others who were there. As I did so, I noticed my weight returned to what I was used to. Again, I staggered, but this time I was able to catch myself. Instead of falling, I quickly turned to my classmates and informed them of my plan. I need everyone, soldiers and students alike, to organize into squads of 10. Next, I want everyone to group up with at least one equal squad of Hylians for each group of students. Stick with your group and protect each other so that no one gets hurt. Once you find your group, spread out. I want no entrances left open and no positions unguarded. I watched as my friends began to meet up and exchange greetings with these men whom they had never met in their lives, but in a way that reminded me of a greeting between close friends. To nobody's surprise, not everyone was particularly enthusiastic about listening to me, but after some brief negotiating, nearly everyone was willing to follow my instructions. After a few more basic orders, the various groups spread out across the school, completely fortifying all points of entry as well as several other locations throughout the campus. As they marched into the school, I noticed several of the soldiers, Captain Bargen included, lose their balance in a similar way to myself the moment they crossed the ring. But most of them quickly made it back on their feet and continued their march. Having several first-hand experiences, I figured that this would likely affect our opponents as well, and immediately began thinking of a way we could use it to our advantage. The captain and I headed to the roof with a number of archers to better assess the situation, as well as add some long-range fortification to our position. We gazed out across the barren, deserted landscape to see exactly what we were up against. While it was difficult to make out through the heavy rain, we were able to see a host of strange creatures advancing towards us. The captain quickly identified them as Sia's army of monsters. I called down to my armies below, warning them of the approaching threat, and ordered the archers to prepare their bows for an opening attack. They all loaded their weapons and aimed them upwards, setting up for an arching strike that would hopefully deal a serious blow to their forces. Then, we waited for the enemy to come in range. For this brief moment, everything stopped. The commotion of preparation had ended, and every single person was holding their breath in anticipation for the battle that would soon take place. The world fell silent to the point that the only sounds were the gentle patter of the now fading rain. Fire. A flurry of arrows soared across the field, striking down nearly a third of the enemy troops. I observed the armies of the enemy as the arrows pierced them, and noticed that instead of falling to the ground, the deceased monsters simply burst into a purple dust that faded after a moment. Despite the rather sufficient loss, the enemy continued to approach with furious speed. Disregarding the previous observation, I called down to the people on ground level, warning them to be ready for the attack, and ordered my archers to fire another barrage of shots. By the time the army reached our location, their numbers had been cut down by more than 2/3 their original size. Concluding the archers' work to be done, I immediately rushed down to ground level in order to assist the armies on that floor. As soon as I touched ground again, I drew my sword and ordered everyone to wait until the enemy had crossed the ring. We continued to hold our positions, watching as the continued barrages of arrows shot down from above, taking out more and more troops with every second that passed. Finally, the enemy troops had reached the ring, and I ordered my armies to rush their location. As we ran toward the enemy, I observed them closely to see that my predictions were correct. The moment the army crossed over the ring, they lost their balance, and as a result of the sudden shift in gravity, many of the monsters fell to the ground. Capitalizing on their uncertainty, my armies began a relentless onslaught of attacks, striking down nearly every monster within their ranks. It wasn't long before we were able to completely obliterate the armies of our opponents, causing the few monsters who remained to execute a hasty retreat. Cheers rang out across the school. Students, staff, and soldiers, who were all overjoyed at our speedy triumph over the enemy, began to throw miscellaneous objects into the air. I sheathed my weapon and turned back towards the group, only to find Captain Bargain approaching me.
Congratulations, sir! How do you feel after your first major victory?
Honestly, that felt pretty good. I had no idea that...
Dodongo!
I hadn't even finished my sentence when the cry of one of the archers rang down across the school. I turned towards him, only to watch as a massive ball of fire shot from beyond my view, striking the corner of the wall where the soldier had been standing. Dozens of people rushed out of the way of the falling debris, many only narrowly avoiding its clutches. I quickly turned my head to find the origin of the explosive fireball that had nearly decimated a part of our army. Looking into the distance, I saw a massive reptilian creature emerging over the horizon.
Dodongos. I should have known Sia's army would have some sort of backup plan like this.
What do you mean? What is that thing?
That is a Dodongo, a massive fire-breathing lizard. They're incredibly powerful and their hides are nearly impossible to penetrate.
Keeping my eyes fixed on the beast, I drew my sword once more and made a motion to approach it. But before I could begin my assault, Captain Bargain grabbed me by the shoulder.
Sir, what are you doing?
There are people out there who are counting on me to finish this battle, whether they realize it or not. One way or another, I need to do this.
Of course, sir. I will follow your lead. But if you wish to take on the beast alone, I recommend you bring these with you.
He reached behind his shield and pulled out a small blue sphere with a piece of rope attached to it. I glanced at him suspiciously, considering questioning how he pulled this object seemingly out of nowhere, but decided that we didn't necessarily have the time for such inquiry. Instead, I took the ball from him and waited for further instructions.
While Dodongos have very thick hides, their insides are very susceptible to explosives. This is a bomb that will help you defeat it. If you can find a way to light it and get it to somehow damage its insides, then the day will be won.
I thanked the captain for the advice, and immediately ran off to fight the monster. As I approached it, I realized I would once again be forced to cross the mysterious ring that continually threw everyone off balance. So, instead, I prepared myself for the sudden shift in gravity. Anticipating the change, I forced the first step I took onto the foreign terrain to be stronger and more forward than any step prior, and using the increased strength from the intense gravity, I shot like a rocket at an incredible speed toward my enemy. Reaching speeds I had not previously thought attainable by any human being, I quickly approached the monster, effectively catching it off guard. Realizing how close I had gotten to it, the beast let out a piercing roar and began to breathe a steady stream of fire at me. I ducked under the flames, raising a fuse into the stream, lighting the bomb and beginning the timer of how long I had to defeat it. With the help of the surrounding rocks and my newfound strength, I catapulted myself high into the air and rotated my body to face the monster. In a frenzied rage, the beast let out another roar in my direction. Seeing what could possibly be my only chance, I hurled the lit explosive into its mouth. As the bomb entered its system, the Dodongo quickly closed its maw as to avoid getting any other foreign substances caught in its throat. Within moments, the bomb detonated, stunning the monster and knocking it onto its side. I aimed my sword downward towards the beast and began my rapid descent. Putting as much force into the blow as I could muster, I drove my blade straight into the creature's eye, avoiding its hide and cutting into its skull. The beast howled in agony and began thrashing about in a chaotic manner. I held on for my life, thrusting the sword deeper at every opportunity I had, before being thrown off the monster completely and slamming into some nearby rocks. The impact was so strong that it knocked my glasses off of my face completely. Pain shot through my body, and with now blurring vision, I watched as the creature flailed its body in agony before falling to the ground, lifeless and defeated. I sighed in relief, only to feel another bout of pain shoot through my back. Moments of silence passed as I found it harder to stay awake through all of the pain. As I sat on the ground, I heard the call of the captain and nearly a dozen other soldiers behind me. In an attempt to stand up and greet them, I instead fell to the ground and faded from consciousness.
Chapter 3. Strange Requests. The following is a continuation of the account residing in Tycalra's journal.
Tycalra, Tycalra, wake up!
I slowly opened my eyes, groaning, and saw a woman standing in front of me. She extended her hand out as to help me get up off the ground. I graciously accepted her offer, grasping her hand in one of my own and using our combined strengths to pull me up. As I stood up, I examined the woman and noticed that she was actually quite tall. Her face gave off a gentle smile, and her eyes were a bright blue color, almost to the point that it seemed like they were glowing. Her outfit was unorthodox, appearing to have a sort of steampunk design. She wore a tan dress that was absolutely covered in folds and frills, and around her stomach was a brown striped vest that seemed to cut off right underneath her breast. In her silvery white hair, she had a pair of very old-timey looking goggles and a hair clip that was adorned with various gears. If I hadn't known any better, I would have said she had walked straight out of an old sci-fi western film. When I returned my gaze to match hers, I saw that she wore a hurried and concerned expression.
Please, listen, I don't have much time.
I didn't quite understand what she meant. I looked around us trying to find any potential threats that might limit our time. As I did so, I quickly realized that I was not where I was when I had fallen unconscious. Instead, I found myself in front of a large temple surrounded by a lush, jungle-like environment. The temple was adorned with many small red hearts, as well as large blue gears that appeared to match the steampunk fashion of the woman in front of me. I looked back to the woman in order to more directly ask her the many questions I had. Who are you? How does everybody know that name? What do you mean by not much time?
None of that is important right now. You will completely awaken soon, and when you do, I need you to find this place.
And where is this place exactly? The woman opened her mouth as if she wanted to say more, but no words escaped. A panicked expression rushed across her face as she started to disappear from my view. She quickly mouthed the words, "Find me," before she faded completely from reality. Hello? Is anyone else out there? In a panic, I began to call out into the jungle, which I noticed was also fading around me. I found it increasingly difficult to maintain my balance as the ground around me disappeared into a white void. A wave of fear rushed over me as the only place left to stand crumbled out from under my foot and I began to fall. Then, I opened my eyes. I looked around and realized that I was on a bed in some sort of tent. I sat up and more closely examined my surroundings. From what I could tell, I was in a medical tent of some sort, but it was different than any medical tent I had ever seen. Instead of medicines and other similar tools, I instead saw the area littered with numerous books and scrolls. Curiosity surging through me, I reached over to a small table that housed a stack of books in order to get a closer look at them, and saw a shattered pair of glasses. I reached up to my face and came to the sudden realization that this broken pair of lenses had previously belonged to me. Again, I retreated to my thoughts. Wondering what I was going to do without my glasses, I looked up and noticed that I could clearly see beyond the books on the small table next to me, a feat I had not been able to do since I was very young. I looked out across the tent, further observing my surroundings, and quickly realized that somehow, my vision had been repaired to the point that I no longer needed the assistance of corrective lenses. I later learned that the Hylians are pretty heavy magic users, especially when it comes to healing magic, and in an attempt to bring me back to health after my battle with the Dodongo, they must have healed my eyes as well. Pleased with my new findings, I began to explore the tent from my bed. I looked around at all sorts of magic books and spells before hearing a host of voices outside. From what I could make out, it seemed as though the captain I had recently gotten to know was addressing several other people I didn't recognize.
He's incredible, Your Highness. Truly spectacular. He's everything the legend said he would be, and he hasn't even had a chance to make them yet.
Calm yourself, Captain. I know you are excited by being able to fight alongside the hero of legend, but we must maintain a certain level of formality.
I don't know, Princess. I think it's okay to be a little excited. I've been observing his exploits for generations, and I'm getting a little giddy over this.
And your reactions are understandable. But please remember, these are his first impressions of this world. He doesn't know anything about any of us, and is yet to establish himself as the hero we have come to know. Let us help him to feel as welcome into this world as we can.
As I listened, I looked around the tent, trying to see if I could at least see the silhouettes of the people producing the voices. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't make out anyone beyond the walls of my shelter, so I instead decided to continue listening as their conversation continued.
Captain, may we please enter so we can speak to him?
Of course.
Alone?
Of course.
Faded silhouettes began to appear by one of the entry points on the tent, before a large flap of cloth was pushed open to allow the figures to enter. Gradually, 4 individuals, 3 women, and 1 man began to enter the tent and face me. The first woman to enter wore a regal dress adorned with a pink lace and numerous triangular symbols, as well as a royal-looking crown that sat on the head of some of the most blonde hair I had ever seen. The second had sky blue hair and wore a white skirt and a deep blue top that left her stomach exposed. The third woman was dressed in a type of battle armor and possessed a sword sheathed on her back that was taller than me and wider than my head. Finally, the man wore a deep green tunic and cap, while also possessing a more traditional blade that seemed to match the one I had previously been given.
Hello, Tycalra. It is good to see you awake.
Hi? I felt bad addressing them in such an informal way, but I was still slightly in shock from the whole situation that it was all I could really muster at the moment.
My name is Zelda, and I am the Princess of Hyrule. I understand that you are confused, and I guarantee that all of your questions will be answered in time. But first, we would like to request something of you.
What could I do for you? No offense, but I was a nobody just this morning. I don't think there's much a princess could gain from me.
This says otherwise.
Everyone in the room looked over at the man clad in green as he pulled one of the Dodongo's large red horns out from behind him and tossed it onto the floor. The 3 women almost seemed to be shocked by his presence, but I was more just confused trying to figure out where he was keeping the horn.
Not many people are capable of defeating a beast like that, and those of us that can would never be able to fell it so quickly. For someone who had never held a real sword in his life before, I'd say that's worth some attention.
I looked at him, a bit taken aback from his bold statements. I had never had anyone talk about me like that, and the man's words surprised me, causing more questions to arise by the second. How could this group of strangers trust me so completely? Why do they all think that I'm someone special? Why does it seem that they all know who I am already? I sat there for several moments, considering these questions and the dozens of possible answers, each theory being more impossible than the last. But before I had time to speak again, the woman with the blue hair walked up and knelt down to match my current height.
Don't you see, Ty? You're so much more than you think. Even if you haven't had the chance to become the hero we know yet, you are still destined for greater things.
Destined for greater things? Yeah, right. I don't believe in destiny.
Whether you believe in destiny or not is irrelevant. You've already proven through your actions that you're capable of dealing with whatever life throws at you, which brings us to our ultimate request. We would like to ask you and your friends to continue to lead our armies and help us win this war once and for all.
My eyes widened. I guess I had known it the whole time, but it hadn't yet struck me that the one battle I had participated in wasn't the end of the bloodshed. While I had been caught up in figuring out what had happened to me, other people were busy fighting an entire war. I sat still for a moment, trying to take everything in, as a new wave of fear rushed over me. This wasn't some sort of game. This was real life. It may not have been the life I was used to, but it was still real. Real people were getting hurt. Real people were dying. Real people were leaving their families, unsure if they would ever see them again. And I was pulled right into the middle of it.
You don't have to decide right away, and we won't blame you if you say no. But we could really use your help.
We'll leave you in peace while you decide.
And remember, choose what you think is right. Please do not feel obligated to do anything because we asked you to.
The 4 figures left the tent as I continued to sit in silence. I stared at the Dodongo horn the man had left behind, remembering how incredible it felt as I vanquished the beast. but even still, I wasn't sure. I wasn't a warrior, nor did I have any experience in fighting other than that early battle. A wave of thoughts ran through my head, some reasons to fight, some to run, and others still odd amalgamations of both. I stood up, hoping that some fresh air might help me think a little better, and began making my way towards the tent's exit. I pushed aside the cloth and stepped out into the school campus, only to see that the troops had made a temporary camp within it. I stood still for a moment, observing the world now drenched in the darkness of night. I watched as my friends and companions bustled around the crowded courtyard, mingling with our new Hylian acquaintances, moving crates of supplies from place to place, or taking some combat pointers from some of the more experienced soldiers. I smiled, watching the quick companionship between two kinds of people who were literally worlds apart. None of them asked for this, and yet here they were, working together to make the most of their situation. As I took a few more steps forward, a loud voice echoed across the courtyard. "He's awake!" Startled, I turned to look for the one who had just shouted, but before I got the chance to see who it was, I was swarmed by my fellow students, each one shouting joyous praises of my victory against the enemy army and the lizard-like beast that had attacked us. As the arms of nearly a dozen students lifted me into the air, a host of new thoughts rushed through my head. I now knew what I had to do. After a minute or two of endless praise, my friends fell silent and parted to allow the four figures from earlier to approach.
Have you made your decision?
I have. A hushed silence fell over the school. Every single person eagerly awaited my announcement, determining whether we would continue to fight, or we would stay at the school until we found a way to return home. I will fight with you, but only under one condition. I want at least 100 highly trained troops to stay here and protect my friends. We didn't ask for this, and most of us know nothing about combat. For this reason, I want none of them participating in this war any further. Zelda turned back to discuss my proposition with the other leaders of the army. Silence fell across the courtyard, save only a few hushed murmurings from various points within the crowd. For a moment, I thought that what I was asking was too harsh. In this kind of situation, every asset counts, and asking them to lose even a portion of those assets, well, who knows what kind of damage that would cause. But I needed to know if they truly believed that I was destined to save them. If they did, they would have me help them, no matter the cost. After several painful minutes of near silence, Zelda returned her gaze to mine.
Tycalra, what you are asking is difficult. You're asking us to sacrifice a sizable number of troops for a single person.
And if I truly am who you say I am, then that sacrifice will be worth it. Zelda turned back towards her other captains as if to get their input. But before any words could be spoken, they all gently nodded in her direction. She nodded back to them before once again facing me, a faint smile now on her face.
I think you're finally beginning to understand. Welcome to the Hylian army.
Chapter 4. Preparations. The following is a continuation of the account residing in Tycalra's journal.
We spent the next few hours preparing for future ventures. Princess Zelda picked out the 100 troops that would stay and protect the school, and prepared the remaining army for the upcoming battles. As the troops began to prepare themselves, Zelda called a meeting with all of the generals to decide what our next move would be. We all gathered in one of the classrooms at the school in order to meet in privacy. The Hylians had brought in a large circular table that contained a large map and placed it in the center of the room. On the map were somewhat crudely drawn images of all sorts of different things I didn't recognize. I did, however, recognize the school, which had a number of tokens placed on it, which I was able to guess was supposed to symbolize our troops. As all of the generals began to file into the room, I quickly realized that I wasn't the only one who wasn't exactly where I was supposed to be. Excluding those I had already met, it seemed that everyone else was in a similar situation to myself, having been transported away from their homes by a mysterious orb of light in the air. The weird thing was, all of them were from Hyrule, just at different points in time. Why was I the only one here who seemed to be from another world entirely? With yet another one in my collection, I started to worry that all of the questions I had been saving since I had arrived wouldn't be answered at all. growing slightly frustrated, I once again pocketed my questions and turned my attention towards the princess, who had now begun to speak.
Thank you all for being here. I understand that you all must have many questions, but I worry that we have more pressing matters at hand. Sia's army is only growing, and we need to find a way to stop her once and for all. We will need assistance from all of you if we are to succeed.
Zelda's gaze slowly worked its way around the room as she examined the group. After seeing everyone in our party, she took a deep breath before continuing her address.
But I suppose, since most of you are foreigners to this particular era of Hyrule, and have never met before, some introductions are in order. I am Princess Zelda of the modern era, and it is a pleasure to be standing alongside such great monuments of this world's mighty history.
Finishing her instruction, she turned to the being next to her and gestured for them to also introduce themselves, starting at the woman with the large sword.
I am Impa, leader of the Sheikah tribe, and I will be leading most of the troops from this point forward.
The introductions slowly continued around the table, each one giving small descriptions of who they were and what era they were from. Fi from the era of the sky, Darunia and Rudo from the era of the hero of time, Agatha and Minna from the era of twilight. I should note here that I have chosen not to write most of what they said, simply because it is not relevant to anything that happens beyond this point. Regardless of how relevant it was, and how much of it I understood, I thought it was still fascinating to see so much history in a single room. I can't imagine that people come in direct contact with this many icons of the past, especially since, according to what I had heard, they had all been dead for centuries. However, with this, I feel the need to point out that it is a character flaw of mine to let my mind wander. When I see or hear something that I find particularly interesting, I have a tendency to tune out the world around me and instead turn all of my thoughts elsewhere. I was so lost in thought that I hadn't even noticed everyone looking at me and waiting for my introduction. Oh, hi, I'm... Again, I hesitated. Up until now, no one from this world had heard my real name. They had all continually addressed me by the title Tycalra. I wasn't sure if I should reveal the truth or share what would be familiar to them. However, after remembering the way the Hylians cheered when they heard that name, I decided to officially take on the mantle of Tycalra. This name clearly means something to these people, and I don't want to impede on their hopes by revealing the truth. My name is Tycalra. I'm from Earth, not Hyrule. I've never been in a war before, so I'll be relying on you guys to show me the ropes. A few chuckles echoed throughout the tent, and I couldn't help myself but join them. I was glad that even with the threat of war, we were able to keep a positive mindset. When I had gotten here, everything was so serious, and it made me happy to see that things were finally starting to lighten up a bit. I looked around the room at the merry band of heroes we had gathered. I smiled, grateful to see that I wasn't the only new guy. No one here knew each other, and yet, despite being complete strangers, we were all here, united under a common goal. Each one of us had in some way been negatively affected by Sia's forces, and all of us wanted to stop her. The remaining introductions continued mostly as expected. A few Hylian captains introduced themselves, and I was finally able to identify the blue-haired girl as the sorceress Alana. I was surprised, however, when it got around to the man in the green tunic. Instead of speaking, a small yellow fairy appeared out from under his hat.
I'm Proxy, and this is Link. He doesn't talk much, so if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer in his stead.
Confused, I looked at Proxy. I knew that Link had spoken to me relatively openly before, but now he seemed to be less talkative than a potted plant. As I wondered why he suddenly wouldn't speak, I remembered the expressions of surprise that Zelda, Lana, and Impa had made when he'd spoken to me earlier. It seemed to me that Link wasn't much for conversation, which would explain why the others were surprised when he suddenly decided to talk to me. I shrugged it off, since I know how hard it can be to talk to people sometimes, and returned my attention to the task at hand, planning to ask him about it later.
Well, now that everyone has been introduced to each other, shall we get things underway? I shall be blunt and propose that we make haste in obtaining the Master Sword. With all the gates of souls closed, that will be our best chance in our quest to defeat Sia.
A flurry of "I agrees" and "Hear hears" rang out across our small group of heroes. I was about to agree with them, as some of the troops had filled me in with some of the history and legends of Hyrule and its heroes before meeting. But when I opened my mouth, I remembered the temple I had seen in my dream, and the woman who had asked me to find it when I woke up. Noticing my hesitation, Zelda turned to question me.
Do you disagree, Tycalra?
What? No, of course not. I think that's probably our best option. If I have my facts straight, the Master Sword will be integral to our success. But the thing is, while I was asleep, I saw a vision of a temple in the middle of a jungle. And there was a woman there who told me to find it as soon as I woke up. Even if I have to go on my own, I feel like I need to go there first.
You saw the Angel's Palace.
The angels what now?
The Angel's Palace is the place where your weapons, the Blades of Destiny, were to be kept so that you could retrieve them when you next arrived, which I suppose would be now. It's no surprise that you're getting visions telling you to go there.
I haven't even considered that you would need to retrieve the blades. That complicates things.
So the question becomes not what would be the first step, but which is more important, the Blades of Destiny or the Master Sword?
Could we split up and go for both?
That sounds like a horrible idea.
Why not?
We don't want to spread too thin. If we do, then Sia's armies will be more equipped to destroy us.
Not to mention the fact that almost all of you need to be present in order to break the seal on the Temple of the Sacred Sword.
I watched as a fairly heated argument broke out in front of me, debating the importance of each of our goals. I had no idea such a simple statement would spark such a debate, but I knew I had to do something about it. My mind raced, trying to find a way to get everyone to calm down. Looking for possible strategies, I looked down at the map we all stood around. Leaning over to one of the soldiers who was standing right next to me, I asked if he knew where the Angel's Palace and the Temple of the Sacred Sword were located. He nodded and pointed to two different locations on the map. One appeared to be in a dense jungle area, and the other was in the middle of an open plain. To my surprise, the two were not incredibly far from each other, and it seemed as though they were both about the same distance away from us. I quickly began to formulate a plan that I felt would most effectively retrieve both of the weapons that we needed. What if Kronea is right? If we planned it right, we may be able to do both at the same time. Everyone suddenly became quiet, and all eyes turned to face me. Well, looking at the map, the two don't look very far from each other, and I was just thinking, well, what if most of our troops start to head towards the Temple of the Sacred Sword to get Link the Master Sword, but a few of us take a slightly longer route through the jungle? That way a couple of us could break off in the jungle and go to the Angel's Palace completely undetected. If the large group makes a big enough spectacle of themselves and the smaller team is subtle enough, we should be able to get both weapons, distract Sia's forces with a more prepared army,
and get the weapon from the Angel's Palace without them even noticing.
That just might work.
I looked around the room once again and saw a general consensus of agreement among my peers. I felt somewhat proud of myself. Not only had I gotten everyone to stop arguing, but I had come up with a solution that everyone seemed to agree on. Maybe it was foolish of me to put pride in such a simple and relatively meaningless task, but to me, a 17-year-old, coming up with such a solution was one of the most impressive feats I had accomplished up to this point.
Well then, it's settled. In the morning we shall begin making preparations to approach the Temple of the Sacred Sword, and Tycalra can begin preparing for his own journey to the Angel's Palace.
A series of cheers rang out throughout the room, and for the first time since I had gotten to this world, I felt at home. This may not have been what I had asked for, and I certainly didn't know anyone or anything about this world, but I knew it's where I needed to be. I was going to give this world a real reason to remember the name Tycalra.
Chapter 5. The Angel's Palace. The following is a continuation of the account residing in Tycalra's journal.
A human's ability to adapt is a peculiar thing. No matter what happens or where we are, it's almost guaranteed that humans will find a way to survive. Even if our bodies can't physically handle the harsh environments, we invent technological creations to help us withstand it. This was a part of humanity that had always fascinated me. But recently, I've become even more interested in the way that it's affected me. 6 months ago, I would have told you that I was never going to war. I would never join the army, I would never carry a weapon, I most certainly wouldn't kill anyone. And yet, within the span of just a few days, I was leading an army of trained soldiers, and I felt completely comfortable doing it. Participating in a war was something I always promised myself I would never do. But now, I won't hesitate to pick up a blade and fight. It's not just me, either. Many of my friends and classmates who used to shudder at the thought of violence are now taking fencing lessons from some of the Hylian soldiers. As much as it pains me to admit, there have been times since we got here that I wondered if it would be better if we didn't find a way home. None of us would be the same. We've seen the heart of battle, and I don't think anything we could do would be able to erase that. True to her word, Zelda began preparing the troops for the trek across Hyrule the very first morning after the meeting. It was ultimately decided that while the majority of the group headed to the Temple of the Sacred Sword, Lana, myself, and a small group of 30 men would break off in the jungle and head towards the Angel's Palace. However, preparations were slow. Not necessarily because we had a lot to do, but rather because we were low on supplies. It turned out that when the Gate of Souls opened up to the different timelines and different worlds started to collide, the Hylian army had split up in order to deal with the many threats around Hyrule. This really did a number on their supplies, especially when my world showed up unexpectedly and the princess made an effort to regroup here. We had enough supplies at the school to sustain us for quite a while, but very little of it was portable, and there was no way it would provide for an entire army while on the move. As a result, most of us just ended up waiting at the school while the princess sent a group to Hyrule Castle to retrieve a new shipment of supplies. In the meantime, those of us at the school began training for the battles ahead. We all started learning proper swordsmanship from the Hylian soldiers, and a few of us were even able to learn a few magic spells. I wasn't incredible at it, but I did manage to consistently pull off both a shield and healing spell. Sia's armies tried to attack our position a handful of times during our time at the school, but we were so well fortified and had so many troops that all the battles were inconsequential to our army and were all over in mere minutes. Probably the best thing that happened while we were stuck there was I finally had the opportunity to approach Lana with a few questions that I had been holding on to since I got to this world. Upon my inquiry, she eagerly informed me that the reason people were able to pull large objects seemingly out of nowhere was due to a spell that most Hylians learn during their childhood that creates pocket dimensions designed for storing objects. She tried to teach me the spell, but I guess my accent was wrong, so it didn't really work for me. Lana also taught me all about dimensional densities and weights. According to her, every single dimension has its own separate density, and the life forms that live there are well adapted to that standard. However, when a being comes from another dimension, their bodies are naturally different densities. This explains the weird gravity shift I kept feeling when crossing the barrier between my world and the world of Hyrule. My world is naturally heavier than that of Hyrule, so I'm heavier as a result. But probably the most important piece of information I learned was how all of the Hylians knew who I was. Lana explained that the reason everyone in this world knew me was because, according to their history, I had been there before. Apparently, sometime in my future, I'm going to return to Hyrule's past. It is during this time that I'll supposedly make a name for myself. I must admit that I'm not exactly comfortable with the idea that my future has already been determined. As I said before, I was never one to believe in fate and destiny, but it seemed to me at the time that I may have been wrong. We stayed at the school for a good 3 weeks waiting for the supplies to come in. By the time I left the school, it was much less of a school and more like a large fort. The classrooms had been converted into barracks, the courtyard and gyms into training grounds, and nearly all of the students had been formally trained in some form of armed combat. It would have been a jarring sight for anyone else, but to us, it had become somewhat of a home. Eventually, the supplies arrived from Hyrule Castle, and we began to make the trek to the Temple of the Sacred Sword. Overall, the journey was rather uneventful. In accordance with my plan, my squad successfully broke off from the rest of the group while we crossed through the jungle. We silently trekked for a while before reaching a small clearing coated in shade from the dense trees that stretched high above us. Just as we had hoped, the clearing seemed empty, but despite this, we still proceeded with caution, under the assumptions that we weren't alone. In the center of the clearing was the temple I had seen in my dream. Getting a closer look at it, I could clearly make out many detailed decorations that appeared all along the outside. A large pillar decorated in the small red hearts I mentioned earlier held up the center of the structure, although I now noticed that the hearts were upside down. I also saw a series of 6 other pillars that featured hearts of the basic colors of the rainbow, although these ones right side up. And, in accordance with my dream, the rest of the temple exterior was adorned with weaving patterns of large blue gears. We all stood outside the temple for some time, marveling at its remarkable design. As we stood, I noticed something inside the temple almost sparkle a little bit. Out of curiosity, I stepped forward and peeked around the central pillar to get a glimpse inside of the building. In the back of the foyer stood a golden frame containing a large portrait of 3 figures. One of the figures was a young girl who looked to be about 12 years old at most. The girl had dark brown hair and wore a pink shirt along with a sky blue skirt. The second being was a beautiful woman who was much more mature in age. She boasted pitch black hair and a skin tone that reminded me of milk chocolate. She also wore a pale violet dress that went down below the bottom of the portrait. The third figure was me. I was older in the portrait, but not by too significant of a margin, only being in what I would guess were my mid-20s, maybe. From what I could tell, I still wore the exact same green sweater that I found myself wearing at that particular moment, but on my back, I could clearly make out the hilts of 2 swords. The hilts were the same in overall design, but one was a deep blue color and the other a bright red. I stared at the portrait for no less than 5 minutes, wondering if this was the life I was destined to lead. I asked myself what sequence of events would ultimately lead me to the scene I saw before me. I couldn't really tell you why, but even now, thinking back to the way that the woman in the purple dress seemed to smile at me, makes me eager to find whatever future leads me to her.
Fascinating, isn't it? The way time works is such a mysterious thing.
I jumped at the sound of the mysteriously familiar voice behind me and quickly turned to face it. As soon as I did, I immediately recognized the figure I saw before me. There was no mistaking it. This was the woman who had called for me in my dream. I don't suppose you have time to introduce yourself properly this time, do you?
Yes, I suppose I do. I am Kronea, the goddess of time.
It took me a minute to process exactly what she had said. Goddess? That didn't make sense. Did it? While I thought carefully about each word the woman had said, the rest of our squadron entered the temple. As soon as they entered the room, everything fell silent, except for a few hushed murmurs. I heard my troops mumbling vague phrases like, "Is that really who I think it is?" and "I must be going crazy." Despite this host of curious mumblings, I watched as each one of them came to a realization of whose company they were in, and respectfully took a bow aimed at the woman standing before me. She really was a goddess. Kronea nodded humbly in the direction of the soldiers before quickly turning back towards me.
Please, Tycalra, follow me. I have much to discuss with you.
She turned away and began walking towards a separate room off to the right of the main hall. I hesitated a bit, still somewhat in shock from everything that had just happened. By this point, I had more or less gotten used to the wildness of Hyrule, and had even come to understand some of the different kinds of magic, like what made me able to see without my glasses and the bottomless pockets, but I had seen a painting, supposedly of my own future, and then was suddenly greeted by a goddess? I had no idea what to do or how to respond. Noticing my hesitation, Kronea stopped by the entryway to the next room and patiently waited for me to gather my thoughts. I don't know if I can accurately describe it in words, but something about the way she looked at me, it made me feel confident, determined. Somehow, I knew that things were going to turn out all right. With newfound determination, I made my way over to the entryway where Kronea had been waiting for me. She took a somewhat slow pace down a very expansive hallway, giving me ample time to observe the remarkable decor of the room. Spanning all the way around the walls was a massive mural depicting a detailed chronology of a winged angel in a green hood. I observed as he took on horrifying creatures that were larger than life and continually prevailed against all opposition. What is this? It's incredible.
The walls of this temple depict a possible outcome of time.
What do you mean?
Despite what it may seem, time isn't set on a specific course. Everyone has free will and can make the choices that they please. Any glimpses of the future that you or anyone may see are merely the result of the most likely choices, and those can be altered or changed.
So, say, for example, that someone was to look into the future and see someone dying. They could potentially act on that vision and save that person?
That is correct. Eventually, the visions of the future would correct themselves on a new path that involves that outcome.
So how does that affect you, being the goddess of time and all?
I exist on the same plane of space and time as you. I, too, follow its flow as anyone else would. I can see the predicted future, but even I don't have the perfect knowledge of what lies ahead. My role is merely to observe and protect the timeline, and make sure that the histories and timelines that have been established stay intact.
So you basically stop people from changing the past?
Yes. When aspects of history are altered, that creates what is known as a time paradox. In the event of a paradox, the timeline does not know what to do with itself and is prone to collapse in on itself. I exist to repair paradoxes and rewrite the timeline, should that need arise.
Wait a second. I was told that in my future, I would go to parts of Hyrule's past. You say that everything in the future isn't set and that the past can't be altered. But how does it work if someone's future is someone else's past? At this, Kronea paused. A solemn expression grew on her face, and she let out an exhausted-sounding sigh.
Your situation is a special one, and I think it will be better explained once we get where we're going.
We continued in silence for the rest of the journey as we passed through an expansive series of rooms and hallways. All along the way, I watched the walls, reading the murals that predicted a possible future, marveling at each image and gawking at the horrible monsters that could be found within. After a long, silent tour of the temple, we entered what seemed to be the back of the palace. The room was quite expansive and featured dozens of shelves with miscellaneous objects displayed on them. Weapons, pieces of armor, paintings, instruments, and many other things that would take too long to mention. In the center of the back wall was a large stained glass window with the same 7 hearts that I saw on the pillar in front. And in front of the window was a pedestal with 2 blades inside it. The hilts of the blades were identical, except for the colors, with one being a deep blue and the other a vibrant red. Both were wrapped in a violet padding around the handle and had a cubic, translucent gem on the end of them. There was no denying that these were the same 2 blades that I could be seen wielding in the portrait at the entrance to the temple, and on the murals throughout. What is this place?
This is the Collector's stronghold, and those are the Blades of Destiny.
Chapter 6. Blades. The following is a continuation of the account residing in Tycalra's journal.
The Blades of Destiny. These were the weapons that I had heard so much about. All the stories that I had heard back at base camp. All the legends that had been recited around the fires. All the prophecies of my eventual return to this world's history. They all foretold me holding these legendary blades. You want me to just take them? Slowly, I approached the pedestal where the blades were placed and stretched out my hand.
Wait. Before you do, I want you to know what you're getting yourself into first.
I stopped and turned back to face her. Much to my surprise, she wore a solemn expression on her face, almost as if she was sorry for something. I was about to ask what was wrong, but she spoke before I could.
If you take those blades, you will be pledging your service to me as my guardian angel. You will go where I tell you to go, do what I tell you to do, and you will represent me when I cannot be present.
Kronea,
I know it doesn't sound very appealing based on that description, but I promise I'll do everything in my power to let you live how you want to, and I can
Kronea, wait. She stopped speaking, as the beginnings of tears started to form in her eyes. This probably isn't the best way to say this, but you should know that I'm not stupid. I can tell you're dodging something. Something you don't necessarily want me to know about yet. Probably because you think it might influence my decision in some way. So, I have to ask, what happens to you if I don't take those blades?
I told you earlier that I was responsible for repairing the paradoxes in the timeline, and that those paradoxes are created by people altering aspects of the past. Fixing paradoxes is extremely dangerous, even for me, and requires incredible amounts of energy to do. The worse the paradox, the harder the fix. Earlier, you asked what would happen if you never returned to Hyrule at any point in your future. To make a long story short, failing to draw those blades would cause you to escape, returning to this world's past, and that would create the largest paradox I've ever had to repair. Having to completely rewrite the entirety of Hyrule's history without a key member would require so much energy that it would likely prove to be fatal. In order to prevent this, I urged you to this temple, so you could draw the blades and become the man who appeared in the legends of the past. However, I am a firm believer in giving people agency, and you have a good heart. So I knew that if I had told you the truth now, you would likely draw the blades just to save me. I didn't want this to be the thing that made you decide what you should do.
To be honest, I was probably going to take them anyways. I may not have necessarily lived a bad life, but I didn't exactly live a very eventful one, and I always felt like there was something more I could be doing. I'm not entirely sure why, but something about my adventures here in Hyrule have made me feel complete, as if I'm finally doing what I was supposed to do with my life. I don't need to take those blades simply because it's what's best for you. That's just an added bonus. I need to take those blades because it's what's best for the both of us. Kronea smiled at me and breathed a sigh of relief before uttering a hushed,
Thank you.
I turned back around to face the blades and stretched out my hand and clutched the hilts of the swords. With one strong pull, I slid the blades out of the pedestal in which they had been held and raised the one in my right hand triumphantly into the air. For that brief moment, the world stood still. I looked up at the sword to truly take in its full form. The blades themselves glistened in a glorious rainbow of light coming from the stained glass windows behind the pedestal. But the way the light reflected on the blades, I would have almost said that the light was coming from them. The hilts were firm and comfortable and seemed to conform nicely to my hands, and the swords themselves were fairly light, which allowed me to easily and gracefully swing them around without taking much of my strength. Blades now in hand, I turned back to face Kronea, only to see her holding a matching pair of sheaths, both carefully and intricately detailed with a host of weaving patterns and designs. She wore a faint smile as she extended them out towards me.
May I present the first of many gifts I have for you, the holders for your blades.
I graciously accepted the gifts, sliding the swords into their sheaths before slinging them over my shoulders. We stood there for a moment in silent gratitude towards the actions of the other, before being suddenly interrupted from one of the soldiers in my party. He bore a worried expression on his face and spoke in an exhausted tone as if he had run all the way to us.
They followed us. We're under attack.
Wait, who followed us?
One of Sia's generals. Lana is currently defending the temple entrance, but we won't last much longer without your help.
I understand. I'm on my way. I reached up and grabbed the hilt of one of my blades before making a motion to the exit of the palace.
Tycalra, wait. I have one more thing I need to do for you before you leave.
I stopped and turned to Kronea, curious as to what was so important she needed to stop me from saving my troops. Before I had any time to ask what she was going to do, she gently placed her hands on my forehead and began muttering several words in a language I didn't understand. It was clear she was casting a spell of some kind, but I had no way of knowing what it was doing to me. Before I knew it, Kronea had stopped speaking and was releasing her hands from my head. Feeling no different than how I had felt before, I flashed a confounded expression in Kronea's direction. What was that?
I'll explain on the way. Now go.
Still slightly confused, I decided to shrug it off and began running towards the entrance of the temple, weaving around the various corridors we had taken to get to the Collector's stronghold. About halfway through the temple, I again heard Kronea's voice, clear as a bell, ringing inside my head.
Tycalra, can you hear me?
Startled, I looked over my shoulder, not realizing that she had followed me the whole time. Much to my surprise, she wasn't anywhere to be seen.
You won't find me that way. I'm still back at the Collector's stronghold. Just before you left, I cast a spell that would expand your mental capabilities. You'll think faster and smarter, you'll remember things longer and easier, and most importantly, you are now open to psychic links with other similar minds.
I must say that following this statement, I expected to be confused, or at least surprised by the sudden realization, but for whatever reason, this didn't really do much of anything for me. It just made sense, even though it was completely out of what was normal for me. It suddenly felt like second nature to be communicating telepathically instead of verbally, even though I had never done anything like this until now. So I guess from now on we'll be communicating this way then.
Yes. While I will be able to talk to you directly some of the time, telepathy has proven as the safest and easiest way of communication. So it is likely that I will use this as the primary method to address you.
Sounds good. Anything else I need to know before taking on whatever is waiting for me outside?
Just don't die.
I'll try my best. With the entrance to the temple drawing closer and closer, I could see my fellow soldiers holding a defensive position just outside, with Lana relentlessly firing spells to a location out of my view. As I stepped outside, I once again used the difference in my density to leap over the soldiers' heads, just as I had done with the Dodongo, and landed shortly in front of them, creating another small crater in the ground. I could hear the cheers of my comrades as I now stood facing our enemy. In front of me was a large, bulky man who was garbed in a scaly red armor and wore a mask that looked like a dragon's skull and appeared to be covering his eyes. In his right hand he held a long pike. With only a subtle smirk, he pointed it directly at me. With a firm determination, I drew my blades and held one out in front of me and one to my side, getting ready to either defend or attack depending on what he did. However, at the sight of the Blades of Destiny, his expression slightly shifted from confidence to that of discomfort. From what I could tell, his original intent had been to stop me before I could retrieve them, but he had arrived just a little too late, and the sight of the blades took him by surprise. Not wasting any time, I launched myself forward towards my enemy, swinging both blades in a sort of cross-like motion. Despite being caught off guard by my possession of the blades, the man was much faster than I anticipated, as he swiftly dodged my strikes and counterattacked. He swung his weapon directly at my chest, but appeared to miscalculate his aim slightly and ended up hitting me with the long hilt of the weapon. Regardless of what he hit me with, this guy had a ton of power behind his swing, and I was easily tossed aside into the trunk of a nearby tree. Not built to support such a powerful blow from something so dense, the trunk cracked behind me and the plant started to topple towards me and my enemy. I quickly propelled myself to the side as to avoid being crushed by the massive jungle tree, while my opponent released a stream of fire from his mouth, incinerating in an instant. Hoping to take advantage of his distracted state, I rushed towards him once again and swung my blades toward the joint in his armor that surrounded the inside of his elbow. Unlike my previous attempt, I was actually able to connect my attack and left a sizable gash on the inside of his right arm. In pain, he dropped his weapon on the ground and clutched his arm with his free hand. Stopping some distance away, I turned back to prepare myself for another attack, planning to aim for his legs, when he suddenly began to bolt in my direction. Before I could even react, he had transformed his left hand into something resembling a dragon's arm, grabbed me by the neck, and slammed me to the ground, causing me to drop my own weapons. I struggled relentlessly to break free from his grasp, repeatedly bashing his arm and head with my own hands, but seeing no visible effect. Completely unfazed by my attempts to escape from his grasp, my opponent smirked and began beating my face with his injured arm. Quickly realizing that I was getting nowhere trying to push him off of me with force, I reached out and tried to reclaim my blades, but he had dragged me just out of their reach. I could feel my strength fading. Yet, even despite that, I tried again and again to combat the continued strikes from my enemy. But nothing I did had any effect on him. As the last of my strength left me, I knew I had failed. The legends were wrong. I had promised to protect Kronea, and yet I couldn't even protect myself from one man, much less stand up against an entire army by myself. With one last burst of desperation, I called out into the darkness, letting out one final cry for help. But nobody came.
Chapter 7. A Second Chance. The following is a continuation of the account residing in Tycalra's journal.
I woke up in a large, open field. A vast, beautiful plain stretched out for as far as I could see, with nothing occupying its space except for a small bed of golden flowers and a single tree planted within it. I looked around to see if there was anyone with me, but I couldn't see any signs of Kronea, my attacker, or anyone else for that matter. Was I dead? No, I couldn't be. Not quite sure of where I was or what I was supposed to do, I got up on my feet and approached the tree in the distance. As I got closer, I noticed that the leaves of the tree were trimmed into a large, perfect sphere. But even stranger than that, there were no visible signs of any branches being cut into that shape. It was almost as if the tree itself had grown that way naturally. Similarly, the bed of flowers was laid out in a perfect circle with the tree planted directly in its center. I stopped underneath it and looked out at my surroundings once again. Sweeping my gaze across the field, I quietly took in the beauty of the world I found myself in. After standing there for just over a minute, I suddenly heard a voice call out to me.
Taken from the hollow earth, a child of time will prove his worth, and though a stranger to his world, the child shall see his fate unfurled. With destiny held in his hand, against the darkness he shall stand, and though at times the child may fall, he shall rise again and heed his call, and by his hands the world shall see the light return, and the darkness be freed.
I looked around, trying to find the source of the strange poem. Based on sound alone, it didn't seem to be coming from any discernible direction, but instead seemed to be feeding information directly to my brain, similar to how I had communicated with Kronea just moments before. After another minute or so, I was about to give up my search when the voice called out to me again, this time giving me one simple command.
Look up.
Hesitantly, following its instruction, I cocked my head upward into the tree to discover that while the outside of the tree's canopy was finely trimmed and smooth, the inside was almost completely hollow. Even more surprising than this, however, was what occupied the expansive interior of the canopy. Clutching the trunk of the tree, staring directly at me, was a large dragon. Caught completely off guard, I tried to take a step back, but instead stumbled and collapsed to the ground. I tried to get back up on my feet, but the beast quickly slithered down the trunk of the tree and began to circle me, trapping me in place. Eventually, the creature stopped in front of me, stretching itself out, allowing me to take in its full glory. Its body was covered from head to toe in glossy green scales which reflected the sun's rays in such a way they appeared as if they were glowing. The beast was also massive, towering several yards above me and forcing me to back up slightly in order to meet its gaze without hurting my neck. When I finally caught sight of its face, I noticed several sharp fangs that protruded out from its closed lips, almost as if they were unevenly spaced within its mouth. I eagerly awaited for it to open its mouth and speak again so that I could catch a glimpse of how its teeth were aligned, but to my surprise, it never did. Instead, I could hear its words echoing within my mind, clear as day, as if it were whispering directly into my head.
Greetings, dreamer. I am Droman, and I have been selected to escort you toward your divine destiny.
I was speechless. There were no words or thoughts that I could recite in response to what had been presented before me. Droman eagerly awaited my response, saying nothing until I addressed it first. After several moments of gathering my thoughts together, I was finally able to utter out a mumbled phrase. What are you?
Regrettably, it is not yet time for me to reveal the answers to inquiries such as those. I am simply here to intervene in your current path, as to ensure your success in this battle.
My head was spinning with all kinds of new information. I felt as though Droman was being completely honest with me in the best way that he could, but ultimately just ended up being needlessly cryptic, almost as if he assumed I knew more than I actually did. What are you talking about? My current path? Ensure my success?
Were you not aware of the unfortunate fate you met at the Angel's Palace?
I stared at him, somewhat wide-eyed, and shook my head. Realizing his mistake, Droman respectfully bowed his head in my direction and breathed what I think was a sigh.
During your battle, you were overtaken by the Dragon Knight. You did not survive that battle. You are dead, Dreamer.
I had no idea what to make of it. I felt fine. I couldn't really be dead, could I? And what if I was really dead? What was this strange field? Is this heaven? Hell? Some strange space in between? Had all of this been for nothing? What would happen to my friends back at the school? What would happen to Kronea? Why had I been brought so far just to die? I fell back onto the flowers behind me, my mind racing and still completely unsure as to what to make of the information I had just received. I wanted to ask more questions, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't force my mouth to shape the words to do it, and my thoughts were moving too fast to ask them telepathically. For what felt like hours, I just sat there, staring at nothing, wondering what to do, until everything, all my thoughts, all my words were interrupted by one simple statement.
Do you wish to go back?
My mind halted and clutched onto Droman's words like a life preserver during the most severe storm, as if it was the one thing that was going to keep me sane. For this one brief moment, it was the only thing I was going to let pass through my mind. For this one brief moment, I wasn't going to let anyone or anything take away the hope that came with it. Do I want to go back? Of course I want to go back. There are people who are counting on me and I let them down. But what can I do? I'm dead.
Within the multiverse, there exists a remarkable power. With this power, Kronea's chosen angel may revert the flow of time, even after death, to an earlier point in their lives and change their future without creating paradoxes.
What do I need to do?
That is something I cannot describe to you, as every angel has done it in their own way. You must simply focus your mind and find the part of your soul that contains this hidden power and find out how to use it for yourself.
Gently, I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to focus on everything I had into returning to the Angel's Palace. I let my mind wander to all of the wonderful things I had seen and learned over the past few months. All of the incredible people I had met. I thought of the murals on the walls of the palace, envisioning the many adventures I would have. I thought of Kronea and all the people who still needed my help, and I thought of the mysterious woman in the portrait that I never got to meet, and pondered how our meeting would occur. As if it were some kind of instinct, I stretched out my hand and gently placed it on something that I knew would be there, despite that space being empty just moments before. I didn't get to see what this object was, but as soon as I touched it, it seemed to disappear out from under my hand, and I began to feel a gentle breeze. I opened my eyes and instantly realized that I was back in front of the Angel's Palace, staring down the man who had killed me, both of us without a scratch. The blades of destiny were still slung over my shoulders, resting within their sheaths, waiting to be called upon. I had done it. I had somehow traveled back in time to just moments before our battle started. And this time, I intended to win. Slowly, I drew one of my blades and pointed it at my opponent, attempting to scare him just as I had the first time, while still leaving my other hand free, knowing exactly where and how he would attempt to strike me. As I had anticipated, the confident smile melted from his face into emotion that could only be described as fear. Again, I rushed towards my enemy, swinging down my blade in his direction. Again, he quickly dodged my attack, preparing himself for a counterattack. And again, he swung his pike at me in a way that would just end up hitting me with the blunt end of the weapon. But this time, I was ready for him, and I refused to let my enemy land even a single blow on me. So I reached out and grasped the long hilt of the weapon and held it in place for a brief moment. My opponent looked up at me in shock, but before he could ask any questions about how I predicted his movements, I dropped my blade onto the ground, clutched his arm with my now open hand, and swung his body over my shoulder, slamming him onto the ground and leaving a small crater on the earth. I pulled his pike out of his hand and slashed at the crack in his armor around his elbow, leaving the same scar I had during our first battle, this time from his own weapon. Cheers erupted from my fellow soldiers behind me as I dropped my enemy's weapon, picked up my own, and turned back around to meet them at the temple's entrance. As I approached them, I heard a familiar sound behind me. I stopped in place for a moment, drew my blades, and quickly spun around, swinging the hilt of one of my weapons at the now approaching noise. The Dragon Knight crumpled to the ground, clutching the side of his face with his left hand, which was now transforming from its dragon form back to its regular form. He had already killed me once that way. I wasn't about to let him do it again. Before he had the chance to get back up on his feet, I aimed my blade at his neck. I glared at my opponent one final time, seeing only fear and acceptance in his eyes. He knew he was going to die. I was about to end it right there, getting revenge for what he had done to me. But something inside of me just didn't feel right. For what felt like minutes, I stood there, fighting with myself about what to do with him. Until finally, I found myself able to mutter two small words. "Get out." I sheathed my weapons and watched as the Dragon Knight hurriedly sprouted two scaly wings and flew off beyond the trees. Slowly, I let out a heavy sigh and turned back towards my comrades. After another string of cheers from my fellow soldiers, everyone began packing up all of their belongings in preparation for our trek to meet Link and the others at the Temple of the Sacred Sword. As they worked, I ventured back into the main hall of the Angel's Palace to get one last look at the portrait of my future. I stood in silence for a moment, simply admiring the artistry of the painting, when Kronea joined me on my right.
She's quite beautiful, isn't she?
Yeah, she really is. You know her?
I can't say that I do, but if my impressions are correct, then it won't be very long until we both get to meet her.
I chuckled as I started to turn back towards the temple's entrance. I'm looking forward to it. We both started walking out the front entryway of the palace, simply talking about the events that had just transpired.
How did you defeat the Dragon Knight?
What do you mean? I hit him hard enough that he couldn't hit back.
Not until after he had already killed you. I'm the goddess of time. Did you really think I wouldn't notice a shift in the very force I govern? Not to mention how you knew exactly what he was going to do, and when he was going to do it.
A faint frown crept across my face. I knew I would have to tell her eventually, but after how bad she had made time travel seem, I was hoping I would be able to keep quiet about it for at least a little while. Hesitantly, I recounted my experiences with Droman and how I'd somehow reset the timeline to put myself back in front of the Angel's Palace. Much to my surprise, Kronea didn't seem to be all that upset, instead just listening intently to my story, occasionally nodding or letting out a gentle sigh. Once I had finished, she just stood there for a moment, muttering some sort of phrase that I couldn't understand. Eventually, she looked up and smiled softly and gently placed her hand on my shoulder.
It looks like I chose the right man for the job.
What do you mean? I thought messing with time was a bad thing.
Under normal circumstances, it is. But with what I put them through, I couldn't possibly expect my angels to be able to do their jobs effectively without at least a little bit of help. All of my angels have had to use the same power you did at some point or another. It's practically a necessity with this job. No, the thing that surprises me the most was that one of the dragons introduced it to you themselves. If the dragons are presenting themselves to you, especially this early on, then I know that I made the right choice in who would be my angel.
I smiled at Kronea before turning my gaze back towards the Angel's Palace one final time. I still didn't know everything about what was going on, or what great adventures still awaited me. But I knew one thing for certain. I was given a second chance, and I wasn't about to waste it.
Chapter 8. No I in Team. The following is a continuation of the account residing in Tycalra's journal.
The journey to meet up with Princess Zelda and the other troops at the Temple of the Sacred Sword was surprisingly uneventful. During the week-long journey, I practiced my new telepathic abilities with Kronea and Lana, who also turned out to be telepathic to a certain degree. I also ended up experimenting a lot with different ways to fight with two swords. I didn't exactly have a whole lot of experience with armed combat, even with the extra training I had during the time we spent back at the school, but I found the two blades to be surprisingly comfortable, and the little practice I did have with the other soldiers in my group only helped me to master my new weapons. When we finally arrived at our destination, we received only the warmest of welcomes from our comrades. Apparently, they too had been met with a surprising amount of opposition from Sia's forces, but they were ultimately no match for the Master Sword. With nothing left for us to do at the two temples, and with our entire army now reunited, we immediately made plans to trek towards the Temple of Souls, where Lana informed us that Sia would be hiding. As we traveled, I got the chance to really build a relationship with Link. We ended up talking for hours about all sorts of things. We shared stories of our lives in our respective dimensions. We laughed as we compared our new weapons' designs, and Link even told me why he was so quiet around the rest of the army. He said that he's normally a pretty open and light-hearted person, but ever since joining the Hylian army, and especially after realizing his role as the hero of Hyrule, the increased expectations caused him to retreat inward and set up a sort of facade of silent confidence. He said that it's easier for people to follow someone who is a confident and powerful leader, as opposed to the kind of person he normally is. I can understand where he's coming from. In the time that I've been here, I've had a much easier time talking to the other soldiers when I at least try to appear like I know what I'm talking about. And they're much more willing to listen. Or at least that's what it feels like. It doesn't matter what kind of reputation you have, or what kind of name you're trying to live up to. A scared kid is just a scared kid in the eyes of a highly trained soldier. And they don't really have time for people like that. As we started getting closer and closer to the Temple of Souls, our forces began to be attacked by several hosts of monsters. And the closer we got, the more frequent the attacks became. But every single time, Link and I were able to easily defeat each mob that attempted to strike us. With our new weapons in hand, nothing was able to stand in our way. Well, that's how it felt at least. I'd love to say that I was able to keep all the success from going to my head, but if I did, I wouldn't exactly be telling the truth. Link and I quickly began to feel unbeatable, and it probably doesn't take a genius to tell you why that's a bad thing. We started performing incredibly risky maneuvers. We actively taunted our enemies. We even started competing to see who could defeat the most monsters. When we finally reached the temple, Link and I were so eager for a fight that we abandoned our allies in the outer gardens and went straight in, not even noticing a pair of large doors closing behind us. Once inside, we immediately began searching the many winding corridors to find our enemy. All the while, a host of taunting words echoed throughout the halls of the temple.
Well, well, well. The hero and the angel have finally come to stop me once and for all. You'd better hurry. I want to see those shiny new swords of yours. You haven't found me yet. I'm growing oh so impatient.
In hindsight, we definitely should have realized that she was baiting us right into a trap, but we were so blindsided by our own confidence that we didn't even notice the obvious mockery of our enemy. After circling the outer corridors, we eventually made our way to the central chamber of the temple, where we found the enemy sorceress waiting for us.
My, what do we have here? Two heroes come to save the day. Unfortunately, I don't have time to wait around and— Ah!
Link and I didn't wait for her to finish. We rushed down towards the sorceress, both striking with a downward swing of our swords. Sia, despite being caught off guard by our sudden strike during her obviously rehearsed monologue, quickly dodged our attacks before firing a shockwave of dark purple energy out of her scepter. Neither of us were fast enough to avoid the sudden spell, and we both were pushed up against the wall by its blast.
How dare you! I knew I was going to have to dispose of the two of you somehow, but after the terrible manners you've just displayed, I'm going to make sure I enjoy it.
Before either of us could get back up on our feet, Sia launched another dark blast of energy, this time focused specifically towards Link.
Isn't it ironic? Your own confidence has poisoned your heart, and now it shall be your undoing.
I watched as a dark echo of my friend rose from his own shadow. The new figure was a pitch-black recreation of Link's physical features, save a pair of glowing red eyes that could pierce through even the darkest of shadows. I knew I needed to help him, so I brought myself back up to my feet and attempted to chase down Sia, but this time she was ready for me. Without making any sort of indication that she was going to attack, she turned back towards me and fired another focused blast of energy straight into my chest. Immediately, I fell to the ground as a sharp, stinging pain shot through my back.
How pathetic. Even with your shiny new blades, you can't do anything without your precious goddess by your side. You're supposed to be an angel. If you can't accomplish that, then, well, you might at least look the part. Farewell, heroes. I would love to see you suffer, but unfortunately, I have other business to attend to.
I tried my hardest to get back up on my feet and chase her down, but the pain in my back was too great. It felt as though the skin around my shoulder blades was tearing apart, and it seemed as though my back was getting heavier. After the pain eventually subsided, I could hear Link calling for my help in the fight against his shadowy double. I picked myself up onto my feet, only to tumble backwards onto the ground due to a new weight on my shoulders. I turned back to see what was pulling me down, only to find that a pair of small feathery wings had grown on my back. Was this Sia's ultimate plan? How on earth was this supposed to harm me? Taking new precautions to adjust for the new and unexpected weight, I again got back up on my feet and made my way over to assist Link. As I approached, I tried to ready my swords for an attack, but as I began my strike, I accidentally moved my new wings in front of my arms, throwing off my aim and causing me to strike embarrassingly far from my target. A brief message for anyone who reads this account: never take for granted having full control over all of your limbs. As humans, we learn to control all parts of our bodies at a very young age, so by the time full motor control is necessary, moving our arms and legs where we want them to is completely instinctual. I had never thought about how much we rely on that instinct until suddenly it was gone. I had to account for new appendages that I had no idea how to control. Even with the sharper instinct given to me by Kronea's mind spell, I was having to dedicate far too much of my mental power into keeping my wings from getting in my way to focus on the fight at hand. The battle with the Shadow Link was long and arduous. Link found it difficult to land a single hit as all of his movements were perfectly countered by his clone, and I was struggling to take control of my new wings for long enough to do any real damage. Eventually, though, we did take him down. We paused for a moment to catch our breath when we heard several pairs of footsteps approaching us. Looking towards the sound, we saw more newly formed Darklings approaching us than were possible to count, slowly getting closer to us, swords drawn. We both knew that there was no way we would be able to defeat another Link, much less the host of figures that presented themselves to us. So, supporting each other, we both made an attempt to escape the temple, but only found several locked doors, preventing us from successfully leaving. Here I was again, in the midst of a fight I couldn't win. There was nothing I could do. I was going to die again. Or at least, that's what I thought. As soon as they were close enough, a handful of Links leapt into the air and prepared a downward strike onto me and my ally. But just before they made contact, the room filled with a flash of light, defeating several of the shadows immediately. I looked up to see Lana looking back at us with a confident smile on her face.
Are you guys okay?
We are now. How did you get in here? The doors are sealed shut.
Let's just say I had help.
She gestured behind us, and I eagerly turned back to see Kronea hovering slightly above the ground, with several strange-looking portals on either side of her. I smiled and turned back towards the last few Links, readying myself for another attack. Living up to my expectations, the Darklings began running towards us for another strike. However, despite being ready for their advances, there was no way we would be able to repel them all at once. Putting all of my strength into stopping as many of them as I could, I closed my eyes and braced for impact. A moment later, I heard a loud clang of weapons clashing together, but felt nothing on my own blades. I opened my eyes again to find that the other generals had come through Kronea's portals and were now blocking the Darklings' assault.
You didn't really think that we'd allow you to take on this fight by yourselves, did you? True strength comes from knowing your own weaknesses, and there's never a time when you're weaker than when you're alone.
I smiled. It was nice to know that there really were people who had my back, no matter how young or inexperienced I felt. With the help of our friends, Link and I got back up on our feet and started tending to our wounds with a few of the basic healing spells I had learned. It wasn't long, however, before the doors of the temple began to open and a new army of monsters began to flood through. We all quickly turned around and prepared ourselves for the battle ahead, and without a moment's hesitation, we effortlessly began to strike down the enemy ranks. Now that we had all of us together, there really was nothing the enemy could do to stop us. When one person was having difficulty, another would take their place to face the threat. Knowing that someone always had my back, I decided to experiment a little with my wings. I quickly found that despite being somewhat small, they were incredibly effective in pushing me around. It wasn't long before I was using them to propel myself out of the way of enemy attacks, or add a little bit of extra force into a strike. I don't want to make it seem like I instantly figured out how to control my wings effectively, because they did still end up being more of a hindrance than a help. But I finally knew that with a little bit of practice, my wings would prove to be much more useful than Sia wanted them to be. The battle raged on for over an hour, but we knew that we would emerge victorious. It didn't matter how many monsters they threw at us, we weren't going to let anyone stand in our way anymore. By the time we reunited with the rest of our army, we knew that we had won. Again, hundreds of cheers erupted from our ranks following our success, and for the first time since I got here, I felt inclined to join them. I had been through many battles in the last few months, but this time our victory felt real. We took the fight straight into enemy turf and won. We overcame the odds, picking ourselves back up when it seemed like all was lost. We confidently and effortlessly defeated an army of monsters that was much larger than our own. To me, that was worth celebrating. As I stood there enjoying the excitement that came from our success, Kronea stepped up behind me and placed her hand on my shoulder.
How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for the safe back there. We really needed it.
Don't get too used to it. I won't be able to do that every time you get in trouble.
I can't make any promises, but I'll do my best. We both laughed for a moment before looking out among the crowd. It was exciting to see so much celebration in the air, and I couldn't help but just watch in silence for a moment. After a few minutes, Kronea chuckled a little and leaned over towards me.
By the way, I like the wings.
Yeah, I wasn't sure at first, but I think I'm going to like them too.
Chapter 9. Nowhere Left to Run. The following is a continuation of the account residing in Tycalra's journal.
This was it. With Sia's forces no longer in our way, the only thing we had left to do was to close the Gate of Souls in the Valley of Seers. If we could do that, then I and all of my friends would finally be able to go home. Once the celebration of our previous victory had subsided, we immediately began to make our way to the Valley of Seers. Luckily for us, our destination wasn't incredibly far from our current position, not to mention that at this point, there was nothing that could slow us down on the way. Nearly all of Sia's troops had fallen at the Temple of Souls, so we rarely faced combat opposition, and we were too determined to be delayed by even the roughest of terrain. After only a few days of traveling, we had arrived. Not expecting to encounter any major obstacles this close to our ultimate goal, we recklessly hurried into the valley. Much to our surprise, however, it seemed as though Sia had set up one last-ditch effort to stop us from reaching the gate. The area was teeming with monsters, so much so that we had no choice but to draw our weapons and fight. Without hesitation, every single soldier in our army launched themselves at the approaching forces, defeating wave after wave of monsters. The battle hadn't gone on for very long when I observed that the creatures we were fighting seemed to be weaker than anything we had seen previously. Even after Link and I had obtained our legendary weapons, the monsters we faced then put up more of a fight than this. Stranger still, however, was the fact that no matter how many enemies we tore through, there always seemed to be more. Up to this point, I had always been able to see a clear end to our oppressors. Not even the incredible might of the army at the Temple of Souls seemed without its limits. But here, the enemies just kept coming and coming. I mentioned this to my comrades and learned that I was not the only one who had made such an observation. Something was wrong, and the other generals and I agreed that we would need to face the source of the monsters and shut it down before we would be able to close the Gate of Souls. Leaving the rest of our forces to take care of the weaker enemies, We instead focused our efforts on plowing a path through our opponents in order to allow us to slip further into the valley. We quickly reached the base of a large ruined temple and noticed that the monsters appeared to be coming from the top of the ruins where the Gate of Souls rested. Since most of the monsters seemed to be approaching from the central exit of the ruins, we collectively agreed that we would try to take one of the side routes in order to avoid the most oncoming opposition. However, when we reached the west entrance, a mysterious wall of flames appeared in front of us, completely blocking our path. Undaunted, we turned around and headed to the east entrance, only to find that the bridge leading to it had also been engulfed in flames. Feeling slightly discouraged, we made our way back to the main entrance, each of us silently praying that our path wouldn't be blocked. When we reached the base of the ruins, I looked up to see a devastating sight. The Dragon Knight, the same one who had killed me just weeks ago, stood at the top of the large staircase, looking down on us. The rest of my party hesitated for a moment, but I knew his tricks. Without a moment to lose, I bolted up the staircase ahead of the rest of the group in order to take him down before he could cause any trouble. As I approached him, however, I noticed something different about him. He didn't have his weapon ready. He didn't appear to be in a battle-ready position, and instead of the ferocity I saw in him before, his face was somewhat expressionless. From what I could tell, it didn't seem like he wanted to fight me at all, and it wasn't long until I was proven right. Mere moments before I reached him, he sprouted the same scaly wings I had seen him use before, as he leapt high into the air and positioned himself behind me. Although, instead of attacking me, he cast a large stream of flames onto the ground behind me, separating me from my allies. I ran back to the now impassable wall of fire, trying to find a way to extinguish the flame and allow my companions entry, but nothing any of us did seemed to have any visible impact.
Tycalra, you're going to have to go on without us.
No, we'll find another way to get you in.
There's no time. If we don't find the source of these monsters soon, it doesn't matter how weak they are. There's no way we're going to win.
But what if I fail? I couldn't stop Sia the first time. What makes you think I'll be able to do it now?
You won't fail, because this time you have your friends behind you. Even if we can't be there in person to help you fight, we will continue to lend you our strength and support. You can do this, Tycalra. We believe in you.
Thank you. With nothing left to gain from just waiting around, I turned back around and began making my way towards the top of the ruins. As I approached, the Dragon Knight landed in front of me with a stern expression on his face. I held out my blades in a defensive position, expecting the worst, but he simply nodded and stepped out of the way. Somewhat unsure as to why the enemy would simply let me pass, I reluctantly made my way up the steps. When I reached the summit, I stopped for a moment in front of him and muttered a hushed, "Thank you," and continued my push into the ruins. I have since thought long and hard as to why the knight would simply let me pass. We were on opposite sides of a heated battle, and he just let me go. It didn't seem to make any sense. Although, now that I'm really thinking about it, perhaps he let me go because I let him go. Despite his fierce fighting style, he was clearly a man driven by honor. And since I let him live after I defeated him at the Angel's Palace, he must have felt honor-bound to let me live at least once. I guess this was his way of repaying the debt that he owed me. Brushing the bizarre interaction with the Dragon Knight aside, I dashed up the ruins with near blinding speed, dodging enemies and obstacles as I went. The only thing that could even briefly slow me down was a massive barricade that had been put in place. But even this was no match for me. By using the combined power of my new wings and my unusual density, I was easily able to vault over the makeshift wall and continue my assault. After not even 5 minutes of climbing, I could see my destination. In a large room at the peak of the temple stood the Gate of Souls, and facing it, the sorceress who had tried to kill me and my friends. My immediate reaction was to simply run in, guns blazing, but we all know how well that worked out for me last time. So instead, I took it slow and stopped just short of the entryway to the room in order to form a more cohesive plan of attack. From what I could tell, Sia was the reason her army seemed to have no end, as every few seconds I would see about a dozen or so dark balls of energy emerge from her body and materialize into more and more monsters. I also noticed that she seemed to grow weaker and weaker with every summon. It was then that it dawned on me. Sia was using her own life force to reinforce her armies. I had to stop her. Not just to put an end to the continuous waves of monsters that she summoned, but to save her from herself. I had already observed that she was now much weaker than she had been, so it was very likely that I could easily hold my own against anything she could throw at me. Not to mention, if I could somehow distract her, then I could potentially stop her from continuing her summoning spell. For once, it actually seemed like rushing in head first was the best idea. With nothing left in my way, I took a deep breath and stepped out from my hiding place and entered the room. "See ya!" Startled, the witch turned around to face me. She looked exhausted, almost as if she were ready to collapse at any moment. It was at this moment that I figured out how I would defeat her. I didn't need to beat her in combat in order to win. I just needed to wear her out to a point that she couldn't fight back. After that, I would just have to close the Gate of Souls and let Lana take care of Sia in whatever way she deemed necessary.
How did you get in here? You were supposed to die back at the Temple of Souls.
Yeah, I've been meaning to thank you for that. These wings have proven to be incredibly useful. Clearly frustrated by my taunts, Sia rushed towards me, swinging her scepter as if to beat me with it like a club. Without a moment's hesitation, I pushed my wings downward, launching me over her head and causing me to land gently on the ground behind her. "Careful with that, you almost hit me!" Again, Sia blindly rushed my location, swinging her scepter furiously in a way it clearly wasn't meant to be used. It looked like my plan was working. Not only had Sia completely stopped summoning monsters, but she got increasingly more exhausted by every single attack she threw at me, magical or otherwise. What's more is that she was in such a blind rage, she wasn't incredibly focused on trivial things like aiming, making each of her advances incredibly simple to avoid. I would write more about the battle, but there isn't really a whole lot to say. She would attack, I would dodge, I would make some taunting comment in order to provoke another attack, and she would attack again. This cycle continued on for a few minutes, until eventually Sia collapsed completely from exhaustion. I never even had to draw my swords. With nothing standing in my way, I looked up at the Gate of Souls. All that was left now was to close this gate, and my friends and I could all go home. Lana had told me that in order to successfully close the gate, I would need to overload it with powerful magic. At first, I wasn't sure what kind of magic I would use, until I realized that I had 2 incredibly powerful magical relics in my possession. So I drew the Blades of Destiny from off my back, leapt into the air, and cleaved the Gate of Souls in half, causing it to shatter into what must have been 100 pieces. My goal had been achieved. The Gate of Souls was closed. I ventured back down the ruins to meet my friends, who eagerly awaited my return. However, our reunion was somewhat bittersweet. While it was true we had been victorious and the war was finally over, this meant that it was finally time for us to part ways. I had grown incredibly close to these people. They had helped me to find a place that I felt like I truly belonged. But the fact of the matter was, I didn't really belong in Hyrule. I wasn't from this world, and there were other things that I would need to do elsewhere. We headed back to regroup with my friends at the school, laughing and crying every step of the way. Kronea also assured me that this was only the beginning of our relationship together, and that she would continue to train me so that when she called on me next, I would be ready. After we finally arrived at the school, we all took a moment, giving out a host of heartfelt goodbyes. But before long, it was finally time for Lana to send everyone back to where they came from. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, as Lana began to recite a spell. Moments later, I heard the chatter of dozens of voices all around me, immediately followed by a host of cheers. I opened my eyes to learn that we had returned right back to where we had been when we first were taken to Hyrule. Immediately, I picked up my backpack that was now resting on the ground next to me and began searching for my journal. And I guess that's where we are now. Here I am, sitting on a bench, writing this account in this very journal, trying to figure out whether it was fate or choice that brought me to Hyrule. In the end, I think it was a mix of both. Lana said that the Gates of Souls opened in eras of Hyrule's past because they each contained a piece of something important. According to her, the Gate of Souls shouldn't have even touched my world. But fate decided that it was important that I was there, so I ended up getting caught in the mix. At the same time, what I did in Hyrule was all up to me. It was my choice to lead the Hylian army. I made the conscious decision to pull the Blades of Destiny from the pedestal. And in the end, I chose to fight in that war. I said at the beginning of this account that I didn't believe in fate. But now that I am where I am, now that I've seen what I've seen, I think that fate does exist. Fate is that little force that pushes us to certain places, causes us to meet certain people, and maybe even manipulates cosmic forces in order to ensure certain outcomes. But it's what we choose to do with the situations presented to us that truly governs the universe. No cosmic force is going to tell me who to be. I have chosen my path. I am Tycalra, angel to the goddess Kronea, and I will choose my own destiny.
Epilogue. The following is an excerpt of a recorded interview between Tycalra and myself. The rest of the interview will be included later in this case file, but this particular part of the interview pertains directly to the events described in Tycalra's journal. Well then, that was a very peculiar story.
You don't believe me, do you?
You have to admit that the whole thing is a little far-fetched. Angels, gods, other worlds. Those kind of things do typically fall under the fantasy category.
What, and just because it's a little unbelievable, it can't possibly be true?
I think this whole thing is a bit more than a little unbelievable. You hand me a notebook that contains a fantastical story about magic and monsters and tell me it's fact. How am I supposed to believe something like that?
Kronea was right. This whole thing is just too much for the normal human to understand. I don't even know why I bothered with you.
Mr. Anmores, I want to believe you. I really do. But I'm going to need an explanation that makes at least a little more sense.
Sense? You want sense? An entire school disappeared off the face of the planet for 6 months, and you expect things to make sense?
Wait, what did you say?
You should know what happened. Do you really need me to repeat it?
No. How long did you say you were gone?
6 months. We left in October.
Well, now I know you aren't telling me the truth.
What the heck is that supposed to mean? We left in October, were in Hyrule for 6 months, and came back—
Mr. Anmores, that simply isn't possible. Everyone knows that North Creek High School has been missing for years.
What?
Do you really not know?
No what?
Your school wasn't gone for 6 months. It was gone for 3.5 years.